All right, gang. Are y'all ready to jump in? Let's nowhere. I'm just learning a little bit about you people. That's all. What's that?
You people.
You people. That's right. Just learning a little bit about you. Having a little bit of fun. There was no segue at all. None at all. I did the icebreaker last week, and I just pivoted right into cannibalism. Weren't you here? I mean, how do you use an icebreaker to pivot into cannibalism? I don't know. I mean, that's above my pay grade. Which means I should run for elected office. I'm just kidding. All right, having a little bit of fun. All right, so I'll clap for you, Ed. Does that sound okay? Are we good? Okay, awesome. All right, so we've talked about a number of things in terms of basic ethical theory. We have a few more that we're going to talk about, and then we'll be jumping into the issues. But just as a quick reminder, the reason that we started with ethical theory is so that you can kind of bend your ear. You can actually hear where somebody is coming from. If you can hear where somebody is coming from, I think you're going to be able to better have a conversation with them. Last week, for example, we talked about utilitarianism. And there are different strands of it, but I wanted you to have the big idea. You know, and the big idea is that the ends justify the means. Now, some of you, actually all of you, from what I can remember, agreed that a part of what we factor in our moral decision making are the consequences of our choices. And that's perfectly fine. However, on the other side, that's a completely different thing than saying the only thing that there is to morality is the ends that I'm trying to get. You know, so the ends justify the means. Well, what if the means are pretty horrible? And people go, well, yeah, we don't want that. But there were times last week, for those of you that were here, you remember you leaned that way. I gave you the famous trolley problem. It's like, how many of you would pull the lever? A trolley is out of control. And you can pull a lever and it will divert the track. If you don't, 5 people are killed, but if you do, 1 person is killed. And most of you are like, I'm probably going to pull the lever, right? And you have this idea that it's an unfortunate situation, but I'm going to try to make the best out of it, right? You were deliberating about the consequences of a choice that you make, and that's perfectly fine. Today, I wanted to jump into a different ethical theory, and then we'll kind of look at the time, and if we can begin another one after that, we will. And it's called social contract theory. I don't know how many of you have heard of that, but when it comes to social contracts, you have a few that are considered like canonical literature for social contract theory. For those of you that have ever read John Locke, for those of you that like the United States, you probably like John Locke because more or less Thomas Jefferson lifted completely from him. More or less. And said so. Thomas Hobbes. So if you've ever heard of the cartoon Calvin and Hobbes, it's named after John Calvin and Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes is the guy that we're going to talk about here in a little bit. And then the third one is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. We're not worried about him as much, but those are the guys that are considered like front and center on what social contract theory would look like. If you were to look at the Declaration of Independence in 1776, you know how it is or what it says. It says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. It's that last part that we're actually going to be focusing on tonight. I want you to imagine a world without rules. Are you there? The movies have been made. And in fact, there's one that has a series of them called The Purge, if you've ever heard of it, where more or less, yeah, it's called The Purge, where more or less all of the social rules are suspended for basically like a day, right? And then the movie unfolds. So imagine a world like that. In that world, you have to remember that nothing is immoral. Nothing at all. And everyone is free to do what they want. Now, the part that we typically like is that last part. Everyone is free to do what they want. Thomas Hobbes, I mentioned before, he called this scenario the state of nature. It's the state of nature. And he described this life as solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. So that said, you might think, So what Hobbes would naturally be inclined to do is to, for example, believe in God. That wasn't where Hobbes went. Instead, what he came up with was a moral system or a moral theory that does not depend on God in any way, that he thought would still actually work. So as he said, in this system you might have an abundance of freedom, but what you don't have is any security. And that makes some sense, right? Because if people are going to give like an unencumbered expression of their freedom, there are all kinds of places that could go. And as a result, probably you're not going to be feeling very secure. Hobbes looks at that and he says, that's not going to work. So what was his belief? What he said is we trade some of our freedom for a secure society, and that can happen through a contract. So we trade some of our freedom for security. Now, some of you have actually heard the opposite of that in the last couple of years, where you're not going to be trading your freedom for security. You heard the opposite of that, especially in 2020 during the pandemic. Or was I the only one that heard something like that in around 2020? You know what I'm talking about? They went the opposite way of Hobbes. Now, to be clear, and I want to be very clear about this, Thomas Hobbes did not think that there was anything real about morality. There's nothing real about it. Instead, what he said is, when you get a group of rational people that are living together, morality, so to speak, will emerge because there are more benefits in cooperating than in not cooperating. All right, so do you track them so far? There's nothing real about it. So what some people think is, well, no, there are moral values, and those moral values are what we would call objective. They're real. And they exist independent of human minds and human constructions. Another way of understanding that is we don't make this stuff up. We discover it, but we don't create it. Hobbes goes the other way. You see that? There's nothing real about this, but we can't live in the state of nature. So, let me give you an example. Let's imagine that in my yard I grow tomatoes. And then let's imagine in your yard you grow oranges or bananas. And let's also say I kind of get my fill of tomatoes after a while, right? There's only so many tomatoes you can eat. And you're kind of feeling the same way about your oranges that you grow in your yard. Well, in the state of nature, if I'm just going to give the free expression of whatever I want to do, well, one of the ways that I can get your oranges or bananas or whatever you're growing in your yard is I can just steal it, right? I mean, that's a free expression, and I'm just going to walk over and take it. That's a possibility. The same would be true for you with regard to my tomatoes. However, what we remember is that we are rational beings, and really, just kind of as a matter of function, that's not going to work very well, right? Or at least this is the way that Hobbes looked at it. So what we do is we promise to not steal from each other. Instead, what we do is we trade goodies. So I give you 2 tomatoes and you give me 2 oranges or 2 bananas. You get the idea? And what we did there is we created a contract with each other. It was a shared agreement. You see what Hobbes is kind of getting at? There's a shared agreement between us. Now, let me step back. Is there anything real about morality? And the answer is no, there's not. However, you and I are just going to come to an agreement because, frankly, we're going to function better that way than if we don't. It's purely functional. That's it. And what Hobbes says is, and in that moment, the contract is made, morality, so to speak, begins. It begins. So what we don't do, we don't violate the agreements that we've made. The agreements are worth it. For me and you, the agreements are worth it because they make our lives better. That's why the agreements are worth it. And so what we do, just a reminder, we trade freedom for the benefits that come from it. We trade freedom for the benefits that come from it. In fact, if you were to read more of Hobbes, and I'm not worried about this so much, but he wrote a work called The Leviathan, and in it he even unpacks the system of government there. And the way that he looks at it is that what we do is we kind of abdicate this control over to the government. We just hand it over to them. And the reason that we do that is because it provides a security that the state of nature would never provide. And what you can't do is start making exceptions to when you do and do not listen to those that are in leadership, because the minute that you start doing that, the system starts to break down. Are y'all tracking them so far? I'm not saying do you agree with them so far. I'm saying do you track them so far? That's what comes from Thomas Hobbes. Now, I gave you a fruit example, right? So I've got tomatoes and you've got oranges or whatever. That one was kind of easy, right? I mean, what we did is we made an explicit agreement, or we made an explicit contract with each other. And what that does is an explicit agreement occurs when you communicate that you agree to something. So, for example, I'll give you $5 for a hamburger. And then they bring you one. Well, you've explicitly agreed to pay that amount. That's one kind of agreement. But I don't know if you've noticed this. Not everything that you are giving or doing have you had that kind of relationship with people. Sometimes it's what's called an implicit contract, or it's called an implicit agreement. For example, this occurs when your actions or inaction, something that you don't do, but you still make an agreement to something. Let me give you an example. If you ask a server at a restaurant to bring you a hamburger, and it says $5 on the menu, and they bring you one, you have implicitly agreed to pay that amount for it. You see the difference between the two? Some of our contracts and agreements are explicit, and then some of them are implicit. Here's the problem, though, as some people have noted. We're bound up in a lot of implicit contracts and agreements, like a lot. And most of them we never agreed to, but we find ourselves in them. So, did you ever explicitly agree to be governed? Did you ever find yourself saying, you know what? I agree to this. Anybody in the room? You did?
Every time you vote.
All right, well, hold on. Hold on. That's different. Voting is the exercise of a right, but that is different than saying that there was a moment where I am explicitly, giving consent to be governed. You see what I'm getting at? Or handing over decision making to somebody that isn't me. That's different. Citizens of these fine United States never agreed to follow the law of the land if you were born here. Like, I was just born here. And there was never this point where they pulled me into the room and said, and as a citizen of these fine United States of America, you have to agree to the law of the land. That's never happened to me. I don't know if you know this, but immigrants do have to do that. It is actually a part of the citizenship process. So, implicit, I'm bringing something up, so there's an implicit consent versus an explicit one. That's an example. Make sense? So those that are immigrating and they're becoming they're citizens of the United States, they explicitly agree to something I never did as a citizen of the United States. That would be one example. Now, one proposal, how do you do this? One proposal is, well, just by continuing to live here, we implicitly consent to be governed by the local rulers. We just do. In other words, if you don't consent to the local government, they would say, you just need to go somewhere else, right? That's an example. So consider these three cases. Your friend asks you this question. Would you, so my Avery is at college, so I kind of scribbled this one down for her. Would you like a ride to campus? And you say yes, and intentionally get into her car. You explicitly consented to riding in the car. Easy enough. Here's number two. You're sitting in your friend's car, and she says, I'm going to drive you to campus now. And you say absolutely nothing. You don't exit the car. You simply buckle your seatbelt. You are implicitly consenting to riding in the car. Here's a third example. You wake up in your friend's car. I don't know what you were doing before, but you did. You woke up. You wake up in your friend's car, which is moving down the interstate at 95 miles an hour. Your friend says, feel free to get out, but I'm not slowing down. Now, if you jump out of the car, you're probably going to die. You get the idea. Well, that's a different situation altogether as well. If you think about this scenario with natural-born citizens, we're expected to follow rules that we never gave that kind of consent to, right? So if you, for example, if you tell the IRS that you never agreed to pay taxes. And you're not bound to follow it. I'm just throwing this out there. You're going to get in trouble. Right? I mean, what they're not worried about is whether or not you gave them explicit or implicit consent. You're just going to be in trouble. Now, here's what it, for Hobbes, who's saying there's no real nature to morality, it just emerges with these contracts, right? Does this seem unfair to anybody? Especially the scenario with the IRS. Or you're driving, you're the one driving down the interstate at 95 miles an hour, and a cop pulls you over. And when they do, you say, but I never consented to drive only 75 miles an hour. I'm going to throw this out there. You're probably still going to get a ticket, right? Does this seem unfair? And for Hobbes, he says, no, this is fair. All of this is fair. It's fair because you have all kinds of benefits from being a part of the system. All kinds of benefits. For example, how many of you drove on roads when you were coming over here? I did, right? That would be a benefit of being a part of the system. How many of you have ever had to call the police? If you have benefited from the system. Or how many of you have ever had to call like firefighters? Or how about the military? You get the idea? And this is what Hobbes is saying, we benefit from this just by being a part of the system. And what that means is because you are directly benefiting from it, you've got to pay into it. It's the way it goes. You don't get to be the exception to the rule. Everybody's got to throw in. Otherwise, the whole thing starts to come apart. Right? Or at least that's what he thinks. And what he goes on to say is that this makes a society both survivable, which remember what the state of nature is like, you're not going to survive in that. And it's every man for himself. You're not going to survive. And it also makes society possible. Now let me step back one more time. Is there anything real about this though, for Hobbes? No. We're just agreeing to this. Otherwise, life is a mess. Okay, that sounds great, right? We've got agreements, we've got contracts and whatnot. That sounds fine. And so when I leave, if I go get a burger and I pay for it, there was a contract between me and whoever makes the burger. That's fine. But the question becomes, can I really trust people to cooperate? I mean, everything hinges on cooperation, doesn't it? For him. So imagine this. And this goes back, there was a study that was done some years ago. You and an acquaintance, let's call him Patrick, have the untoward idea of robbing a bank during broad daylight. It wasn't your best idea, but it was your idea. Now, to your chagrin, it doesn't work out and you both end up downtown. It's not good. The officers have moved you into separate quarters, and you're each being grilled intensely by detectives who seem to be straight out of an episode of Law and Order. And yes, you're handcuffed and sitting in a room under a light bulb. Are you with me so far? The head detective comes in and does not mix words. If you want any chance of a light sentence, you'd better start singing. You'd better start saying something. Now, stop for just a second, because I've got more. Who's going to start talking? Can I see your hands? Anybody? All right, I've got some people. You gonna do it?
I want a lawyer.
You can say I want a lawyer. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Not really what I was going for here. Anybody in the room? Anybody in the room going to maybe turn on the other person? Ed in the back has got his hand up.
The guy who talks first always gets the best deal.
So the guy who talks first always gets the best deal, and he was in law enforcement. People, he knows. He knows. All right, so Ed's going for it. He's ratting them out, right? Anybody else? Anybody else going to rat people out? All right, gotcha. Anybody else? Grace, going to rat them out? Going to rat them out? Anna? Whatever. It's just us here, right? Okay, Anna's doing it. Is anybody going to not? Do I have any takers to say I'm not doing it? Just not going to do it.
Depends on who I'm with.
Depends on who you're with. Hold on to that thought. Hold on to that thought.
Depends on what my lawyer
And it depends. And he's back to his lawyer over here. What did my lawyer say? All right. So after a pretty intense grilling that is more stressful than anything that you have ever experienced, it's clear to you that you have one of two choices. If you stay quiet, you're going up the river for a long time. I'm borrowing some old language there. You're going up the river for a long time. Maybe 5 years or more. That doesn't sound good, does it? Maybe 5 years or more. However, if you rat out old Patrick, poor Patrick, you'll definitely get a lighter sentence, if not just a commuted sentence. That's why Ed was ratting him out, right there. Right there. And you may even be able to spin things in such a way that all you get is something like parole. I mean, all these possibilities for you. So to add intensity to the situation, you realize quite clearly, like you have this moment, you go, hey, wait a second, Patrick's in the same situation in the other room. And you go, I wonder what old Patrick's thinking over there, right?
Didn't you say that they were both collaborating on this bank robbery?
They're separated. Now they did it together, but as they're quartered after they're caught, so they're separate.
But one didn't entice the other.
Whose idea was a bank robbery again?
Well, you were together. You were together. I don't know that the good police are asking those fine of questions. They got you both.
So was it implicit? Implicate?
So now we have, was it an implicit agreement? Yeah. Was it explicit or implicit? You know, and you sit there with the cops and you go, you know what? It was not an explicit agreement. Go read Hobbes, right? Now, for those of you that don't know, do what?
You just asked me for a ride.
I was the person that was asleep and woke up in the car from the previous example. This is, by the way, this is known as the prisoner's dilemma. I cannot remember when this was done. I can't remember what years this was done. But it's called the prisoner's dilemma. And the question is whether people are likely to show loyalty to their partner in this situation. Like poor Patrick, some of you people, I mean. Or if they're likely to betray their partner to advance their own self-interests. And you can see why this would matter to somebody like Thomas Hobbes. Because if the whole idea of the social contract is that we enter into a cooperative relationship, but you find scenarios by which the first thing that's coming to you is your own self-interest, cooperation becomes, well, challenging. Make sense? It becomes really challenging. So in situations, here's what's interesting. In situations where the prisoner's dilemma decision is essentially a one-off, meaning it's like a one-time thing, here's what they found. People typically, not very surprisingly, tended to act in their own self-interests. You know what I mean? So it's not like you're this chronic bank robber. It's just, you know, it's the economy, y'all. Right? Property taxes in Harris County and whatnot. And even after you contest them, they don't care. I'm just telling you that from personal experience. 27 pages of documentation I gave them, and they were like, right? It is what it is. But in the one-off, you're like, you know what? We're going to have to rob a bank. And you do it. It's one. People typically acted in their own self-interest. If you're never going to see this person again, and this is kind of the way I thought, if I'm never going to see this person again, there's little cost to simply going for broke at the other person's expense. Does that make sense? Little to no cost to me. And so, poor Patrick, right? He joined up with the wrong burglar, right? He joined up with Anna, and that was a bad move. However, if you're expecting to interact, this is the other part. If you're expecting to interact with the same person into the future, you might start thinking twice. Can you think of why?
Retaliation.
Yeah, is because that's right. Because if what you have is an ongoing relationship, then what's that relationship going to? The one-off, that's easy. You're like, I'm never going to see this person again. And so, I mean, I'm not sorry, but bye, right? You go to jail and I'll go that way. But if there's going to be this ongoing relationship with them, you're going to be like, hold on. Because what's this relationship going to look like? And what they found is that people were more willing to cooperate in that kind of a situation. So as an example, if you're playing the prisoner's dilemma with Patrick from what we were talking about, and you plan to play against him tomorrow and the next day and the next day and the next day, you're probably going to think hard about betraying him. And that's what actually proved true with people. Because here's Patrick over there. It's unlikely he's going to forget such a betrayal very quickly. And with the betrayal, guess what else comes along with it? All of the lack of trust that cooperation is supposed to provide. Right? Something like that. And he might just bite back, that Patrick. He might get fed up with Anna. You know what I'm saying? He gets sick of her turning state's witness on him and whatnot. Here's the thing. Is it rational for both people as they're quartered? Is it rational for them to squeal on each other? And the answer is, yeah, because all of you were sitting there going, I get it. All of you. I was looking at your faces. All of you are going, yep, I get it. But here's what they said. It'd be better off if maybe you stayed quiet. Just don't talk. Call your attorney over here, right? Okay.
My brother, who's an attorney.
But yeah, there you go. You're going to call your brother. So here's what they find. Cooperation pays, but only when you trust others to keep their agreements. Cooperation pays. Now, are y'all getting Hobbes here? And that's all that there is to morality. This is it. This is it. Now, there is this thing for Hobbes, and it's called defection. And every single person here has probably done it. I'd bet money on it. I had 2 people do it to me in the line at Chick-fil-A when I was trying to feed my girls before I came over here. And I was like, defection. Because, and especially among strangers. Here's the idea of defection. You break the contract you're in, whether you agreed to it or not, and you look to your own self-interest instead of cooperating. Here's what the good people in the line at Chick-fil-A did, also known as Jesus Chicken. I was like, not today. 2 of these people cut me off. Like literally, you know, the lines are going like this, and you start to edge up, and one was like, and cut me off, and I started to edge up, one went, and cut me off again. And then they come up, and they're like, is your name this? And I was like, no, it's not, because 2 people defected, right? There is a cooperation that's supposed to be happening at Chick-fil-A, dadgummit. And it wasn't happening today. Here's where the rest of y'all do it. Maybe not Chick-fil-A, but I've seen y'all driving in Houston. I've seen people driving in Houston. Speed limit is 65. I'm going, stop it. I don't defect. I'm a good moral pastor. So I'm going 70 because you don't know, the axle size can actually affect the way that the size of the wheels affects the way that it reads on the speedometer.
Or you don't want to be run over by the person behind you going fast.
But how many of you have been going something like, just throw this out there, 75 and a 65, and somebody in Houston passes you like you're standing still? That's defection. That's defection. Or they're not letting somebody over. That's not because they're not cooperating. You get it?
That's the front of Kingwood.
That's the front of Kingwood as well. You don't even have to go into the city, right? That's defection. So when you violate a contract with, and this is the thing, Hobbes goes, this is the point though. When it's people that you don't know, you're kind of like, However, when you violate a contract with people that you do know, there is a cost. There's a cost. It could be a penalty, it could be a relationship, it could be something, but there's always a cost. But this is what's important to remember with him. This is how morality just emerges. It just comes out of the contract. Almost like magic. This also means that morality can change. Do you realize that there's absolutely nothing that is stable about this? Have you caught on to that yet? Because if really it's just a matter of cooperation that we have, we can change our mind. And when we change our mind, we just agree to cooperate in a different way. What it doesn't mean is that what we were cooperating about before was like right or wrong. And you go, hey, you know what? We just figured out that slavery's wrong. And so we're going to cooperate in a different way. No. This is well, actually Hobbes would say that slavery is wrong anyway, because you have to freely admit to these agreements, and by definition slaves can't. But you get the idea. It's not that you've advanced in any way. You're just doing stuff differently now. You're just cooperating differently. And that's where folks look at it. Kind of like your hunch last week. You had these moments, especially with utilitarianism, you had some moments where you go, some of this makes some sense to me. I get it. I think about the consequences of choices. But man, something seems off when you don't say something like rape is just intrinsically wrong. It's just like wrong, full stop. That's where people start to go, ugh, I don't want to say that. But both with utilitarianism, because the ends justify the means, it's not talking about just basic duties that you've got, values that you have to uphold no matter what. It's not talking about that. And that's where people kind of get a hiccup. It's the exact same when it comes to the social contract of somebody like a Thomas Hobbes. Not John Locke. I mean, John Locke, if you really read the 2 treatises of government or something like that, he grounds a lot of this into God. Locke's going a different route than Hobbes. Hobbes is not going the God route at all. And you can see he's going to have the same problem, isn't he? Right? So you look at something in The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. There's a chapter, I think it's the 13th chapter. It's called The Grand Inquisitor. And it's one of the greatest kind of fictional statements about the problem of evil. And in it, you have this conversation about, imagine Russian soldiers throwing children up in the air and catching them on their bayonet for fun. Now, I give you the example basically to say, we want to be able to say something like this. This is not just a matter of a social agreement that we had that we said that that was wrong, but that was wrong, full stop. You see the point? What if we didn't cooperate like that? Then, strangely, it would be right. And that's where people go, I don't want to say that. I don't want to say that. Now, the reason that this theory is popular, and by the way, you have encountered it more than you know. As I was unpacking it, how many of you were sitting there going, yeah, I've run into this plenty, right? We all have, because everybody talks about contracts and agreements and whatnot. It's just kind of part of what we are. That much is fine. But just like with utilitarianism, it's fine to talk about the consequences of something. It's a totally different animal to say that's all there is. It's going to be the same thing with the social contract and say, hey, we can agree that when we if I make a contract with Spud or with Brian or something, I need to be a man of my word, because there's trust that's cultivated there. We can depend on each other. You know what you're getting when you have the relationship with me. That's fine, but that is totally different than saying that's all there is. That's all there is. And in fact, when you push it back like another step, you're looking at the contract itself and saying that there's a value there. Does that make sense? No, your word matters. Well, why? The contract matters. Well, why? And what you're finding is that it's actually more than just about an agreement that you made. It's that there's a moral connection to it that we're really locking into. But Hobbes wouldn't be able to give that account. So that's the big idea in what is called the social contract theory, at least according to Thomas Hobbes. Now, I'm going to stop for a second because we're going to go another direction. But do you have any questions about what I've said so far? Grace?
I understand everything you said about the contract and how it emerges from an agreement between rational people. But I don't get the convention of it's not real.
Well, Hobbes didn't have a belief in God, so you got to start there. And so if you're asking the question, what would there be to make morality objective? God's a pretty good player in that conversation, right? Because what you have is someone that is that creates it, so to speak, kind of puts, and we'll talk about this here in a little bit, puts it into creation itself. And it's independent of our minds, and it's independent of our constructions. God's a pretty good candidate, right? He creates it, and we follow it. We discover it, we follow it. If you don't believe in God, then what you find is, well, your candidates for what objective values would be are pretty tough to come by. It's like, where would they come from? And in large part, it's because of what the worldview is, where the worldview is even beginning. It's not beginning with God. It's beginning with a process, right? So when you think about the process, well, nowadays you would talk about something like the Big Bang, right? And then some evolutionary story of the way that the world evolved. But where in that story are there values?
So when you're saying that it's not real, it's coming from the fact that there's no standard, it's just in the moment.
That's exactly right. Yeah, there's no objective standard. That's not what this is. But you also don't want to live in the state of nature, because life is nasty and brutish and short. So we make these contracts with each other.
So then is this theory dependent upon majority rules?
Pretty much.
So if the majority says, yeah, we should all just...
Yeah, I mean...
Then that's...
Yeah, so you're saying, does this basically mean that the majority rules? And the answer is yes, because, in this, somebody is going to get left out, right? I mean, that's just kind of the way it goes. Somebody is going to be left out. Okay, with utilitarianism, somebody was getting left out, right? You maximize the aggregate good, which means, well, some people aren't in the aggregate, right? You do the best for the most, and that's the best that you're going to get. It's going to be the same when it comes to these kinds of contracts as well.
So I'm just thinking, a bunch of 2-year-olds in a room. They've got no idea of good, bad, the other. They want it, they take it, that sort of thing.
That 2-year-olds, that's the state of nature, Charles. I mean,
That's kind of where I'm going.
yeah, well, kind of actually, but of course, obviously, 2-year-olds are not the place where they're going to be making these kinds of agreements and
But in
whatnot.
Hobbes' theory, nobody's making these decisions anyway because
Well, you and I could.
amoral.
You and I could. We could.
But we
And
don't know it exists.
and in fact, if you remember the way that when I read the beginning, that part of the Declaration of Independence at the beginning, and I said, pay attention to that last part. We always zoom in on, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. They're endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, pursuit, happiness. To secure these rights. Did you catch that part? To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. 2-year-olds aren't governing. There's not governing.
Doesn't everybody have a thing about morality in them, right, wrong,
We will-
God gave us? I mean,
Yeah,
doesn't
so-
he deny it, but you still...
Well, Paul talks about that.
Apologetics, the moral law...
Yeah, and we'll get to that. Yeah, we'll get to that. Like I said, what I'm trying to do is just survey some things that are out there so that you can hear where somebody's coming from. Yeah, I mean, Paul certainly seems to think so. We'll get there here in a little bit. When it comes to theistic theories of morality, there are two dominant ones. One is the divine command theory, that we have the moral obligations that we do because, in fact, God commands us to do some things, right? Then there's the second that we'll also get to, which is what's called the natural law theory of ethics. And the basic idea there, as I'll unpack a little bit later on, is that when God created it, He put the laws into creation itself. It's kind of like when Paul says, there's some things you can't not know. And the reason that you can't not know it is because God created you knowing it. Now, there are those, as he says in Romans, that suppress the truth. But notice, that's like, I know the truth, I'm just pushing that down. That would be more in line with like a natural law theory of ethics. Yeah, and we'll unpack that a little bit later on. All right, so how do we feel about... Dan, is your hand up or are you just scratching? I can't I can't tell. Yeah.
It just feels so. What is their answer to somebody that believes that, kind of like the origin of it? So because I thought it was survival of the fittest, right? So nobody wants a contract in that world. Organisms killing each other, things like that. Where's like the origin? Because it sounds like the government, in his view, is driving it, and then people are just magically coming together and making contracts.
Yeah,
Where does that begin?
Yeah, so Danny's question is like, where does all this begin if you're Thomas Hobbes? And remember what I said, because of what he believed about the state of nature, which, by the way, a lot of y'all might agree with him on that, right? How many of you would agree, hey, left to ourselves, this could get pretty nasty. He seems to be in line with like Christian theology, even though he wasn't, an affirmer of it. So where does it start? It starts with understanding the state of nature, and when you understand it, what do you do? In order to have security, what do you give up? Freedom. You give up freedom. So that's why I said, ultimately in his theory of government, he just hands it off. He says, we're gonna abdicate this to the government to make these decisions that we're going to cooperate and follow. Otherwise, you start nitpicking what you will and won't do, then the whole thing starts to go apart. Now again, John Locke didn't buy this at all. Instead, John Locke was, part of this is in response to the divine right of kings, the abuses and whatnot that were going on over in England, right? But when he's talking about we have certain unalienable rights, he's much more clear about where these things are coming from, right? And so he's like, I don't want you to hand that much control over to those people because they're part of the problem too. We need checks and balances here. And so that's where you get, that's where you get us. That's where you get the structure of our government, and not Hobbes. Yes?
Not all states of nature are just problematic and dog eat dog. I mean, you look at a beehive or an ant colony or a lion pride. I mean, there's definitely structures and there's leaders and there's jobs and there's society. They don't have to stop killing each other.
Yeah.
What's their choices? What are they making?
Well, part of the difference, so you're like, look at beehives, they have a structure and whatnot, and you're absolutely right. The difference is we're talking about rational versus non-rational. That would be something that would I'm just telling you it would come up.
Some animals are rational and some aren't.
Yeah, with degrees, but I think to what Hobbes and others are pointing out is we're unique. We have higher order rationality.
And we're not just all apes.
Than non-human animals. I'm just telling you. That's where it goes. Army, did you have your hand up or you just point?
Like Hobbes' opinion, if we all have that innate, God-given innate characteristic and strength of
What is the relevance of Hobbes? Oh, I'm not saying I buy Hobbes. And in fact, I don't. But the reason that we're talking about it, Army, is because some people do buy it. Some people do. And that's why I said the reason that we're surveying ethical theory to begin with is so you can hear where somebody is coming from.
So you're saying people avoid innate characteristics that they have and just assume that everything is up to them.
Well, actually, I wouldn't say up to them. I mean, remember, in the theory, the problem is, or what he's trying to solve, is the problem of the state of nature, that left to ourselves, this is what it would look like, but that's not going to be worth living. It's not going to be worth living. But if you don't have God grounding it, you have to come up with something, Army. You got to go somewhere. And this is where he went. Right?
At the end of the day, isn't it all up to us anyway?
No, because you're going to be willing to pass on certain freedoms that you have to get some security. You make a trade that none of y'all were willing to make during COVID. Freedom, right? Did you not catch what I was saying at the beginning, though? In 2020, this happened. You watched the debate about security and freedom. On one hand, you had people that were very focused on very much focusing on security, and you had others that were like, absolutely not. The government is taking too big of a role, and they were going the other way. And they were saying, this is about what? My freedom, right? You get Hobbes better than you think because we had a litmus test just a couple of years ago, right? All right, if you're good, let me jump on with it. I want to kind of kick off where we're really going to go more next week. Because I want us to talk about two things, and this is kind of getting to your question. You were talking about, aren't there some truths that people know? I think the answer to that is yes. I want to spend some time unpacking it. But I want to say this. If you believe in universal human rights, as probably most of you do, you're probably not a utilitarian. You're probably not the person that says, well, we have to do the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Not if you believe in universal human rights. Okay? You're probably also not going to agree with somebody like a Thomas Hobbes' social contract theory. Not if you believe in universal human rights. By the way, you want to talk about a word that gets thrown around and not defined. The word rights is begging for a definition from some people, right? But here's the way I kind of want to end it tonight and introduce you to a couple of things, because we're going to be shifting into how does God play into this in terms of our ethical framework before we start getting into issues. And again, we'll start with sexual ethics. But I want to say this on the front end. You have to distinguish, even as believers in God, you have to distinguish moral values that are objective and moral values that are absolute. You have to. So I've already given you a definition of objective. right? So when we say that a value is objective, we say it exists independent of human minds and constructions. Charles isn't making this stuff up, right? It's real. It's a part of the furniture of the universe, right? It's objective. Now, when you say that a moral value is absolute, what you're saying is that that is binding on all people at all times and all places. There are no exceptions. There are no exceptions. Now, the reason that I'm bringing this out up front is because there are times, even in Scripture, where God gives a command to specific people that He does not give to other people. Are y'all tracking where this is going so far? And insofar as those commands are given, they are objective. Right? You didn't make it up. You didn't create it. It came from God to you or somebody in the Bible. So if you look at Abraham and Isaac in Genesis 22, the famous story of the binding of Isaac, you know what I'm talking about? Take your son, take him up on the mountain, and I want you to sacrifice him there. When He gave the command to Abraham, He was not giving all of us a command to sacrifice our children. And in fact, he wasn't sacrificed. Remember that, right? Nevertheless, the command is objective. It came from God to him. But it wasn't giving an absolute for all people at all times and all places. Are y'all with me so far on that? Okay. Because I think that there are times where people confuse the two. That if you have something that came from God, well, then it must be for everybody. And I'm like, well, no, careful. It was maybe for them, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it was for you. And the text is what would tell you the difference between the two. You have to do what's called hermeneutics. It's the proper interpretation of a text. But I want you to remember those two terms and pull them apart. All right? Just because something is objective does not mean that it is absolute. That said, there are times where Christians have genuine moral dilemmas. And I'm going to end tonight with a dilemma. You're welcome. Are y'all ready for it? And then we'll pick up next time. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk you through what are called duty-based theories of ethics that are largely theistic. Okay? And I'm going to kind of get your intuitions on what you think about that. But here's the story. So I want you to imagine that you have a woman. She is 2 months pregnant. 1 week after finding out that she is pregnant, she discovers that she has cancer. Now, this actually happened. This is a friend of mine. She has cancer. Now, here's what the doctors said. In order for you to receive treatment, and it wasn't like it was going to be a serious and aggressive treatment. In order for you to receive treatment, we're going to have to terminate the pregnancy. Now, the baby's not going to be able to make this, and so we would want to go ahead and terminate the pregnancy so that we can then begin treatment on you. Well, they have a decision to make, right? If they don't do the treatment, she is not going to make it. So they already know that. So right off the bat, and obviously this is a horrible situation, right? And when they found out, they came to me and are like, well, what's the right thing to do? And so I'm going to ask you, what's the right thing to do?
When you say she would make it,
she would make it.
Without the treatment, though, could the baby go to term?
No. So the problem is that the treatments were going to be too invasive for the pregnancy. That's the problem. Which is why they were saying.
If she didn't do the treatments, could the baby survive? Or would she die?
So if she doesn't do the treatments, can the baby survive? So more or less, the baby's got to get to viability where it can exist outside of mom, right? There's a chance, but there was a chance, but there wasn't a guarantee of that either. So it's genuinely tough. It's genuinely tough. And what you're dealing with, right off the top, is you have two people that you value here, right? You have two people that you value very much. And you kind of feel that tension that if you don't do something, then you're not actually fighting for a life, namely hers, right? On the other hand, you feel that tension where you go, but if I fight for her life, then we're not going to have the baby. You can feel it. You don't have to necessarily explain it tonight, and we're going to pick up next week. Can I see how many of you would go with the treatment? Can I see your hands? How many of you are going with the treatment? Tom is. You are? Anybody else? Yeah, yeah, that's right.
What would be the
You would?
mother's chance of survival with the treatment? Does she have a strong chance of survival with the treatment? Or
So,
is it still a gap?
so you're like, what's the mother's chance of survival with the treatment? It's not 100%. She had, it was a very aggressive form of cancer. It was her only shot. I can tell you that. But it was not 100%. So if you're like, hey, the treatment is the guarantee, they could not tell her that. They couldn't.
But if she doesn't survive, the baby doesn't survive either.
It was iffy. You can get, I mean, you got to understand, this was in, what year was this in? This was in 2001. This was in 2001. So even though they had definitely had medical advancements, they can do more with like sustaining the child now than they could over 20 years ago, for sure.
There was a story in the news today where a woman had a situation similar.
Yeah.
She decided to have the baby, and the baby survived, and she died some months afterwards.
So there was a lady, so that was in the news today? So she had cancer,
I think it was cancer.
and she decided not to undergo treatments. The baby was born, did I hear you right?
Yes.
But the mom died.
No, she didn't.
She didn't die. She what?
She did natural. They had their faith, and she chose to do good nutrition and
Okay.
take care of herself and stuff. And
But she made it?
And she's made it.
Okay.
And it's been, I think it said the report was like 2 years. She's still living.
Okay.
And the baby is fine.
Yeah, okay.
With
All right.
the example that you gave, Jeremy, if she decides to have the treatment, would that harm the baby?
Yes.
So.
It was too invasive. Treatment was too invasive for the pregnancy.
That are harmful to the baby.
Do what?
Aborting the baby
And going forward with treatment. Yep, but the treatment was too invasive. It was very aggressive.
This is the objectiveness of it because, you have to decide, God's in charge of life. Do I trust in human resources, or do I trust that if I don't take the medicine and my baby may live, or we both may die, or they die and I die too?
Well, you got risk everywhere, right?
Yeah.
You got risk everywhere.
So it's really, about your faith in who God is and what you think.
So what would you do?
I would not take the treatment.
You wouldn't take the treatment. Okay. Anybody else not taking the treatment? Miss Sally, you're not? Brian, you're pregnant and you're not taking the treatment. That guy? I'm just picking on you. John, did you have your no? John, did you say no on the treatment?
Yes.
No on the treatment? Why is that?
You don't know. There's no 100% chance. You got to give it 5
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Now I had some others that were like, yeah, I'd go for it. So I want to hear from a couple of you, and then we'll land the plane for tonight. Who said we're gonna do it?
I had a question back on the other side. What would Hippocrates say?
Do no harm. Yeah. So on the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. On the other hand, if you don't advocate for the mom with cancer, the argument is you're doing her harm. You're not giving her the help that she needs.
I said yes.
Chew on it. Somebody said, yeah, we're going to go with it. We're going to go ahead and terminate the pregnancy. It's regrettable, but we're going to fight for mom in this situation. Tom, go for it, man. Why?
First, the mom is a known entity, the child is unknown, we don't know.
So the mom is a known entity, the child is unknown.
Growing up without a parent.
Growing up without a parent is a factor.
The mom gets better, she can have other children.
Okay.
There may be
Mom can have other children.
There may be other children in the family.
Okay.
The husband is also a factor in this. It's their relationship, not just about the child.
Okay, and so the dad is a factor as well. It's about their marriage and not just the child is another reason. Okay, somebody else had their hand up saying, do the treatment.
It's like what he said, it's like discounted future lives, I guess you could say, because you're valuing the life of the present baby over the future life, or 2, 3.
Well, remember, the baby's alive, so you said you're valuing a future life. I mean, the baby's alive in there.
Discounting future lives by being preferable to...
Oh, discounting future lives by being preferable. Okay, I misunderstood you. Okay.
Yeah, I'm not saying I'm for the terminating the pregnancy. I'm not saying...
Oh, yeah, I just misunderstood you. So you weren't saying you were for the termination of the pregnancy.
No, I'm just asking, did you consider like future life valuation equal or discounted whenever...
Yeah, so the question is the future life, so thinking of the child, is that, I think in your words, maybe more valuable?
Future person.
Future person? So if you hold to life having intrinsic value, right, not just functional or instrumental value, if you hold to life having intrinsic value, then mom's life and baby's life are equal.
And
they're the same.
And future lives that she might have are equal as well, or...
That's what intrinsic is. Yeah. So it's not...
I'm not saying future...
Yeah. And I think I get what you're saying.
I'm saying future babies that the mom might have.
Yeah, future babies that the mom might have as well. Yeah. And then them grandbabies, right? This is a genuinely tough situation, though. I think we can all agree with that, right? Were you going to say something?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's like your kid's standing out in front of a speeding train. Are you going to sit there and say, my life's more valuable than my 3-year-old? I can have more kids? So
kind of a counter example. You know, your kid is in front of a train, and you're like, well, my life's more valuable than my kid. So the tension that people feel is, in the situation, what does it mean, say, like as a husband, you know, if it had been Wendy, you know, what would it mean for me to be a good husband and to advocate for the life of my wife? That's a fair question. On the other hand, I would be the dad too. What does it mean for me to advocate for the life of my kid? And especially in a situation where I'm not going to get both. Right? At least that's...
You know your wife, though.
Yeah. What's that? Yeah, I know. Yeah, I know Wendy. That's true. That's right. That's why I'd have to tell her, hey, watch out, woman. Treat me right. I'm just kidding. All right, so I bring up that example. That's the way that we're ending tonight. Let's end on a high note. But the reason that I bring that up is because even in like a room like this, notice that we were having values that were kind of conflicting with each other. And we were even having some honest disagreement, and we had our reasons for why we disagreed. That's why we're going to pick up with it next time. I'm going to talk you through different ways that even Christian ethicists have tried to solve a problem like that. I'm also going to get you into other scenarios as well so that we're all genuinely uncomfortable before the night is over with. But most of those are actually going to be coming from situations in the Bible itself. So that's where we're going next week. Does that sound good? Do y'all want to know before we leave what they chose? Yes. You do? No? Who said no? Yes. You want to wait? No. You want to wait? No. So we're going to be social contractarians right now. We're going to work in cooperation with each other. How many of you?
The rest of us.
How many of you want to know what they chose? Okay. They actually chose to go with the treatment. They did. So they terminated the pregnancy. They went forward with the treatment.
And did she survive?
And she did not. Mm-hmm. She actually passed away like 3 years later. Three or four, it was something like that. But again, it was her only shot. That was it. I mean,
Were there other children?
Were there other children in the home? Yes. Yeah, there were.
That would be a factor too. To carry the baby, or she would
That was
die within that 9 months?
that was very, very, very uncertain that she would make it. Like I said, highly aggressive.
10 seconds to make the decision like you gave us.
Did they have more than 10 seconds to make the decision? Well, yeah. They came and talked to me and others. And anyway, all right, friends. I'm going to land the plane tonight. And are you waving?
What about the position of it's not my situation, I don't have enough information to make that decision?
Oh, like when they came to me?
Well, no, No, but I'm saying you're putting it to us.
Yeah.
To make a decision.
You just feel like, hey, maybe I need more information.
Can I take that neutral position of, I don't know?
Yeah, sure.
You know, it's like, I'm not in
Yeah,
that situation.
yeah, absolutely.
I may say yes, I may say no. I can't.
Of course you can.
Just announce that right here and right now.
Yeah, no, of course you can. Of course you can. All right, so we'll pick up there next time. Does that sound good? All right, I'm going to pray our way out. I thank you, Lord, for my friends that are here, for the things that we've been able to discuss tonight, hopefully of good use and help, you know, especially as we're just kind of out and about. And it's kind of unavoidable that we're going to run into these kinds of topics and why people think what they think and why they think certain things are moral or immoral. And many of them don't think the same that we do. They don't come from the same place that we do. But we want to be of good use and good help. And I pray tonight works toward that end. As we go, help us, Lord, to be a blessing to someone, just to love people well, shine the light of Jesus to someone who might need some hope and peace. I pray that they would see Jesus in us. And we pray this in Christ's name. Amen.